As you begin to work in earnest on your paper assignments, your analyses for next week, I thought it might be useful to fill out some of the materials surrounding women's rights in the 19th century, and particularly as they impinge upon the Episcopal Church. During the 18th century and the early years of the American Republic, the general legal status of women noticeably declined in America. But in the 19th century, the time had come for what we in our day would call feminist reform. Margaret Fuller's Woman in the 19th Century was the first full philosophical and historical statement of feminism by an American woman. But certainly earlier steps had prepared the way. And here again we have to go back to the Second Great Awakening and to evangelicalism in America. One breakthrough that resulted from the evangelical revivals, especially in the western part of the U.S., was the dropping of New Testament strictures against women preachers and teachers. They were ignored. And out of the Second Great Awakening, there also grew many voluntary associations which were supported by local women's groups. These became an important means for sustaining that revival movement. In 1850, then, it's probably not surprising to learn that at Oberlin College in Ohio, which was the first American coeducational college, that school granted a theological degree to a woman. Antoinette Brown, who graduated with a theological degree from Oberlin, was ordained there 3 years later. One of the first women ordained in America. At the same time, women were breaking into the medical profession in this period. But the chief avenue for women's advancement was in education, where women served increasingly as teachers, as headmistresses, but also as founders of schools. Two women, each a feminist crusader in her own way, gained special renown for their lasting contributions to the field of education. The first is Emma Willard, who lived 1787 to 1870. She spent a lifetime as a lecturer and poet, teacher and textbook writer, and headmistress. Her poem, Rocked in the Cradle of the Deep, which you can Google and find online almost immediately, is certainly her best known production. But she's more worthily remembered for founding a female seminary in Troy, New York in 1821. The word seminary in the 19th century was used in a technical sense. It meant seedbed. And a seminary was a place for advanced study beyond high school that would prepare the students either for more formal training in college or in a professional school, or which would prepare the student for a life in the business world or in some job in the larger social sphere. A seminary was then a seedbed from which seeds were nourished until they sprouted and had roots, and then they were transposed to a more formal program. So Emma Willard's female seminary was a seedbed for women that would provide them some advanced training that would prepare them for more profound roles within society. In addition to Emma Willard was Mary Lyon, born in 1797, died at a younger age than Emma Willard. Mary Lyon died in 1849. She led a similar life, culminating with the founding of Mount Holyoke College for Women in 1836-1837, a women's college that only became coeducational in the mid-1970s. Like Willard's seminary, Mount Holyoke answered an immense need for the advanced schooling of girls and for the training of future teachers. With greater intensity than at most schools, the activities and the ethos of Mount Holyoke were focused on the hope that every student would be brought to a personal knowledge and relationship with Jesus Christ. So Mount Holyoke was a seminary. It was a seminary intended to train women to be teachers, but it also had some of those elements that we found back in Oberlin, that is, training women to think about Christian discipleship in very profound ways. One of Mount Holyoke's most distinguished graduates, though not a very faithful disciple of Jesus Christ, was, of course, Emily Dickinson, one of America's greatest poets. I only wish I were smart enough to understand the profundity of her poetry. Other significant contributions to the education of women were made by Matthew Vassar, a devout Baptist brewery owner, put those together, who in 1861 founded Vassar College with an endowment unprecedented in its size, the first true liberal arts college in America that made a place for women. Another, but subtly effective feminist who also did a great deal to advance the work of women's education was Sarah Hale. She was a novelist at first, but for nearly a half a century she held a position of unique influence as the editor of two prominent women's periodicals. I encourage you to read her biography in Hine and Shattuck. She was a very influential Episcopalian. The greatest point of feminist advance in the antebellum period was the result of women's involvement in the temperance movement, and then with a great force in the anti-slavery crusades. So the women's movement was advanced considerably by women's involvement in temperance issues as well as anti-slavery crusades. Excuse me. Ultimately, the anti-slavery movement became deeply linked to the struggle for women's rights, though some wanted to separate the two. You know, we find a similar tension in the mid-1960s in the work of Martin Luther King Jr. It took a while for Dr. King to realize that the struggle for civil rights needed to include the early feminist movement and the anti-Vietnam War crusades that accompanied the struggle for civil rights in Martin Luther King's career. That it took him a while to discover that they belonged under a larger umbrella, the umbrella of human liberation, which Vincent Harding at the Iliff School of Theology has championed since Dr. King's death. Nevertheless, in the mid-19th century, a separate feminist movement did emerge. Most notable was the campaign launched in 1848 at the Women's Rights Convention in the home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton in Seneca Falls, New York. Well, I think you've plenty to work with for your upcoming paper assignment. There's still much to cover that deals with the Civil War and its aftermath, and we'll need to cover that ground more thoroughly next week. In the meantime, since I've been late in getting these lectures up on YouTube, let's set Tuesday at midnight for the paper deadline and Friday at midnight for the peer review. I'll adjust the Canvas sorter to make all of that happen.